Alright, so what I'm going to be working on now is a slab platter with a coil / thrown foot. So I rolled out my slab. I do a little bit more than a 1/4 inch, which is what I'm used to. A 1/4 inch is the thickness of a ruler or a paint stick. But I rolled this out a little bit thicker than that. And I cheated, I used the slab roller. Some people, once they place this on there, you want to get as much, or you want to utilize as much clay as possible. So I try to get it as centered as I can. The plaster mold, or the hump mold underneath, I put that on the wheel first and got that as centered as possible. So the plaster mold is pretty well centered. The clay, not exactly where I want it just yet. I mean, it's placed where I want it, but I want to put some pressure down as I go around. Make sure it's semi-flat before I cut some excess off. I've seen people use a paint roller, like just a dry paint roller, and they roll over this. I'm going to show another way to compensate for that after I cut off some of this excess. You can see most of my excess is on this side here. And I don't want to leave too many handprints because I don't want too much to have to clean up, but I want to make sure it's compressed onto here. And double check as I spin. And the reason I'm sitting off the wheel is because this plaster mold is too big. It's about, I think it's 22 inches all the way across. I know the slab at its longest point across this way was 18 inches. So my bowl is going to be a minimum of 18 inches while it's wet. Obviously it'll shrink once it starts to dry. So now I want to trim off some of this excess. Don't use a needle tool on this plaster mold. It'll cut straight into the plaster mold. My plaster mold here is UG1 that I purchased from my local clay place. But I don't want to cut into that mold because I don't want to have to remake the molds all the time and spend extra money. So I'm going to find a spot where I'm close to getting most of it. So right here, I'm just going to hold still. Okay, I moved just a little bit, which is okay because this is my first cut. I just want to make sure I don't knock my plaster mold off here. So then I'm going to take that excess off. So this first one, it's kind of a rough ride as I try to get a straight line because I'm not cutting in every spot. There's some spots where there was no clay. So it kind of does this little catch and release thing. Normally I would use this as my coil, which we'll get to in a minute. And you'll see what I mean in just a second, but I do want to try to cut that line nice and straight. So you can see this side, it's probably my highest side. I'm going to end up having to cut about that high just because I have that little divot there. So I'm going to get some decent speed on here. And this time I'm going to brace because I know I'm trying to make my final cut here. At least I'm hoping so. Okay, once I hear that hissing sound, I know I'm all the way through. I'll stop my wheel, make a small incision to get rid of this clay. This I could also add to my coil pile. So before I even think about doing a foot here, I want to clean this up. Not just my outside edge, but the whole thing. So I'm going to take my sponge first to the edge, and I'm going to compress back down to the mold. So not only am I holding 2 fingers here on the sponge, but also my ring finger down here. And this plaster will absorb some of the moisture. So I'm not really too sparse with my adding of water. But I also don't want this to dry too unevenly at the end once I throw the top on, or the foot, what is to be the bottom. So this is the part where I talked about they could use a paint roller. But you don't have to. Any handprints I may have made, I can start out here, work my way up. This actually gives it kind of a throne look. And this video I'm going to do in parts. I'm not sure if I'll release them on YouTube in separate parts, like a part 1, part 2, part 3. Because I'm going to do the foot. Later I'll show you how to get decorative with the foot. That'll be part 2 for sure. And then I may flip it over and show how to do some slip trailing designs. And I'll explain the slip and all that stuff when that time comes. So I've made it up to about here. I'm still going. A little too much water. So again, this is not only cleaning it up, but it kind of gives me that thrown look because we get a little bit of throwing lines, but it also compresses it to the plaster mold, the hump mold. Okay, and I'm going to do that one more time. So I do it on the way up, and then I also do it on the way down. You could also do this with your rib. So I'll show you really quickly with the rib, and then I'll go back to my throwing lines, just because I like the throwing lines for aesthetics. But you want to compress just a little bit. This will help prevent warping and cracking. A platter this big does have a tendency to warp. I don't get much issues with cracking unless I use a alternative clay body, like if I used a porcelain slip on the inside, then I do tend to get some cracking, which is somewhat expected and almost intentional sometimes. I'm going to add water all the way up this time. And now I'll just go into stride with my throwing lines. I'm going to kind of dig in this time, which will slow my wheel down more. But I want those throwing lines. So now, some people would get somewhat worried about the centering or lack thereof on this piece. As long as wherever I have it set, I cut it there, and it would push you out and make it uncomfortable if it was too far off. But if I draw my circle where my foot would be right now, now that I've cut this, as long as the plaster mold didn't move, this is my centered point, because I sat here and I cut and made it nice and circular. And now I'm going to make a line to where I want my foot. And this has nothing to do with the aesthetics here. This has purely to do with the coil foot that I'm going to add. As usual, a piece this big, you don't want a foot that's a little tiny foot. You want something that's out far enough, but is also elegant looking. So this was that scrap clay I was talking about earlier. I could roll this into a decent little coil, and I'd wrap around here, but I am going to use one that's pre-rolled, easy bake oven style. So I am going to score this. Okay, just a little bit. Go across those patterns. Score my coil just a little bit. I'm going to cut off 2 ends just to make it somewhat square. I don't think it'll fit exactly right that way, but we're going to find out in the middle or in a minute. Cut that a little bit better. Okay. So I'm going to score this. This technically I'm throwing on there, so it doesn't have to be scored and slipped as well as usual, as if you were, say, sticking on a handle or a nose, but just to be in the sake of habit. So I got a little bit of slip down here in the bottom, which is mostly water. Okay, now I'm going to set my coil down. This thing's huge right now. It's about, say, 1.25 inches thick, so pretty big. Okay, I guessed almost enough. Luckily I am going to squeeze this in. And I'm going to end up cutting some of this off as well. This is a bit much for now. Now that I've got those semi-joined, got a little donut on there, and I'll just give you the once over at a 360. So now I want to make sure that it's in more of a circle. I'm just going to slowly spin, push in where I need it. I just kind of lucked out and got pretty close. Doesn't usually happen that cleanly. See if the rest of the video goes that way. Okay. So now I'm going to take my modeling tool. Let me spin it one more time just for, yeah, right there's a little off. Okay, so now I'm going to take my modeling tool and I'm going to blend downward as I spin. Stay and spin it. And this will all get blended, so don't worry about being super clean, but also, as you see, I went back to a spot. I just want to make sure that it's dragged down fairly evenly from my coil. And the reason it's so thick is because I'm going to do some decorative things with it, and I'll end up cutting some of it down. Now I'm doing the inside just to blend. The blending here is more for security or integrity of the clay. I'm going to go over with the finger real quick. Okay. And now it's pretty much like throwing. I'm going to go in there, smooth out the inside. So it starts pretty rough. I could take a ball of clay, center it, and try to throw it, but I find that it compresses the bottom too much and it leaves like a dent and it just doesn't come out very clean. So I do the coil and thrown portion. So first I'm going to get it basically re-centered. This is also, I've got my fingers inside, my fingers outside, just getting this clay pushed in there, into the piece. And this is the part that probably takes the longest, it's just getting this nice and clean. I've got a big chunk over here that I'm going to get rid of early. I don't want to make a huge mess off of the wheel since I don't have any trays or anything. But I do need to get some moisture on there so that my hands slide. Just scoot a little bit closer. So now I'm not really using my fingertips, that's just because my hand's relaxed. I'm using the heel of my hand, the top of my thumb, or the base of my thumb on the top of the clay, and then my middle finger on the inside, and this will blend. And not only that, but it also helped me get this thing re-centered. I'm already to the point out here where I have a little too much water. Just let this go a few turns. So I want to utilize as much of that clay as possible, but I am going to inevitably end up cutting some of that off. So I'm going to recenter, get as much on there as I can, and then I'll pull up a little bit and I'll level it off. So this is the part where I talked about where I don't just throw a ball of clay on here, center it and throw it, because I dig into the bottom of this thing too much. So here with the coil, I don't find that I dig in as much. Okay, I'll probably do that 1 or 2 more times. Getting some of the water off. And that helps me smooth out the inside. The inside's a little rougher than the outside, even though we got that little blip down there. Then when I'm cleaning out here, I try to make sure that I don't move. So I'm bracing myself against my leg. And a tiny bit of movement, I guess, is okay, but I want to do as little as possible. Okay. So now I'm going to do a semi-pole, just using my thumbnail to get rid of a little excess there. So now just a slight pull. I still want this to be fairly thick, and you'll see when I get to decorating the foot why I do that. A little bit of moisture in there. Okay, so now really it's not so much a pull, it's more to get everything just sort of squared away and even on the way up, and then the only part that'll be left uneven, at least semi-uneven, is the top. And so that part I'll cut nice and level. But I do want this to be about 3/4 of an inch thick. It can be a little less, a little more. Artistic freedom or license. Okay, so right there is where I kind of have to let go because it's already too thin. Right at the top, like right there. Now I'm going to level it by just cutting off as little as possible. Okay, once I'm all the way through, lift it off, save my scraps. So now I've got the rough work done, and now it's time to clean up. I won't do the decorating yet because I need to wait till this gets a little harder. Still, I want it on the wet side because I'm going to end up squishing the clay into a few shapes. I got really into these platters visually, or just as a fan from, what's his first name? Mr. Sperry. I can't remember his first name. I know there's some sons afterwards, but I believe it's Robert Sperry. They were featured at AMOCA on a wall that are really, really cool. And then a friend of mine, Sam Lopez, taught me how to do this while he was teaching at a community college. And loved it ever since and been making them. I've actually made a few of these for friends, customers, and so on. Okay, so that's pretty thick. I'll check my view or my perspective on the camera in just a minute to make sure you get a good view of the top part. So now I'm going to do a little spiral on the inside. It not only compensates for some parts that are not as clean, but it adds a nice little aesthetic. And then I'm going to redo my lines all the way up, just to make it look like it's a little bit more uniform. You could accentuate this, because I mean, when you look at it, you know this part's separate, but I could make a little line like this. Clean that up with a sponge. If I don't want that line at all and I want it to look like it, or at least pretend that it's all flush in one piece, that way some people like to camouflage what they've done. Just personal taste or personal preference. So it's pretty much done in phase one here. Just double checking everything. So at this point, I would want to delay my drying. I don't want it to dry too fast, so I would leave this out maybe an hour, bag it, next day open it in the morning, leave it out an hour or two, maybe 3 at the most, depending on the temperature outside. But that is phase one of the platter with a thrown foot, or a slab platter with a thrown foot. So now I'll give you that perspective I was talking about on the inside. Okay, just a little spiral, but nice and clean. And phase 2 will be decorating.